And now we're going to go back to the cerebellum, I think, right?
Partially.
Partially, with Guillaume Dumas from Mila.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here after 2 years and to have the opportunity to mind jazz with all of you on a topic that is dear to me, which is social cognition and social interaction. So I always start with this slide, like with this word from African in South Africa, Ubuntu. I mean, some know that with the Linux distribution, but it's a word about like in Lev Vygotsky, the fact that we are co-constituted by the interaction we have with others. And it's kind of embodying both my topic of research and my way of conducting research. As you see, I'm a serious collaborator. And to acknowledge also like my team in Montreal now, where we have like amazing time mind jazzing about those topics from psychiatry to machine learning. And some of them gonna be featured in the talk. So the question of other and social cognition is kind of central in cognitive science. And even in the early days of cybernetics, people like von Forster was saying that a naive computationalism can lead to a conundrum when you have to represent people that represent yourself, that represent other people, and so on. And so in one of his last book, Francisco Varela write in this chapter called Step Toward the Science of Interbeing, that indeed assessing the environment as a passive thing that you have to project may be too naive, because this environment is also modeling you in return. And so what you foresee in the story of cognitive science is that we move progressively from others as a problem to others as a form of affordances for interaction, enabling things that we're not able to do on our own. And even pushing, unfortunately, after his death, because he also died pretty young, to generative neurophenology, which is like even that the interaction with others is constitutive of the meaning that we have and our subjective experience of the world. And so recently, we published a paper about these generative neurophenology aspects, extending like the early work of neurophenology of Varela, trying to see mind and brain as co-constituted and not like opposed in a dualistic way, but extending that to this co-constraint with interpersonal dynamics. So like when we're interacting with others, there is a dynamics that transcend the two people that are participating in the dynamics, and these dynamics in return also shape the people. So what is called interbeing space. And so that's the thing we are trying to analyze and study right now with mathematics, but also empirical research. So formerly, most of my work has been in social neuroscience, developing a technology that's called hyperscanning, so multiple brain recordings, and demonstrating that when we are interacting with others, there are like synchronization that appear between the two nervous systems. In the same way that we have also this kind of phenomenon within brains, these things happen also between agents. And so for 15 years, we have been trying to metaphorically tackle this dark matter of neuroscience, because when we started that, like the field of neuroscience, I didn't add much to say about two people engaged in a dynamical interaction. And now, since I joined Mila 5-6 years ago, I'm trying to apply that to AI and see how we can pursue the initial work of Yoshua Bengio, for instance, in the case of deep learning and inspiration from the human brain for machine learning, to cognitive architecture and social cognition. And in that matter, my lab is exploring 3 different axes, one being like continuously the biological plausibility, the other one is trying to better take into account temporal dynamics, and we have already initiated discussion on the discrete versus continuity in computation. And finally, like to take seriously this social embodiment, moving progressively for disembodied chatbots to avatars and robots. So in terms of biological plausibility, we have already seen multiple instances of motivation to turn towards biology. Typically, in evolution, there is a multiple transition that leads to a sociality, showing that actually being social has a huge advantage. So like the cameral eye evolution discovered a sociality in a different path. And our work has shown that in recent evolution, so comparing Homo sapiens with Neanderthal and Denisovan, so late hominids, there is an aggregation of divergence that is co-located with tasks associated with social cognition, including language. And in the neocortex, there is like only one part that seems to accumulate divergence, which is the Broca area, so very interesting for language. But to make echo to Rob's talk, we also detect a much stronger, actually, signal in the cerebellum. And at that time, like, it was interesting to see that from pure bioinformatics, because simultaneously also the Gunz team were showing that using bones and skull from Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, that one of the leading difference in the late hominids was actually in the cerebellum. And as we had discussed earlier, like there is now a growing literature on cognitive cerebellum and social implication of cerebellum. But also, like the genes that we uncovered that divergent in Homo sapiens are aligned with the concept of neoteny and the fact that we have a delayed plasticity in humans compared to other animals. And that leads to also an advantage in terms of enculturation. And so we spoke with Alison about caretaking, and typically this opening window of plasticity may also co-occur with this practice of caretaking, where you can learn much more in a wider window of life. And the last evolutionary advantage that is also brought up by Michael Graziano is the fact that once you have a model and a biological makeup to predict other behavior, you can use also these mechanisms to predict your own behavior. And even Michael Graziano go to the point to say that that's the origin of awareness and self, to have this looping effect on predicting your own state. And we'll see how to deal with that. So there's like empirical research and theoretic theory. So how are we gonna build this thing? And so I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman, being a physicist by training. And on his deathbed, there were like this sentence, "What I cannot create, I don't understand." This other one is also good. Know how to solve every problem that has been solved. It's a good advice. And well, we started with the global workspace, so aligned with the CTM, but coming more from a biophysical background. I worked with Jean-Pierre Changeux, who was part of the neural implementation of the global workspace with Stan Dehaene. And using biophysical models, we established like a simple visual and motor cortex and pools of excitatory neuron with lateral inhibition, and try to show that with a very simple biophysical model, we can solve tasks like trace conditioning that has been associated with access consciousness. So we're not talking about phenomenality, we're talking about reportability. And here, like our simple model with spike neurons can take a stimuli, wait, keep it in working memory, and then push a button if there were like a trigger later on. But one thing was missing is this social and cultural environment. We were like really taking this as a minimal access consciousness proof. And some have argued, like for instance, Emmanuel Shea and Chris Fritz, that the global workspace may need metacognition for sociality and language. So we turned, at that time I moved to Montreal, and Yoshua Bengio was excited about attention schema because they were like proof that this theory could at least be more easy to implement than other theories of consciousness. And so to explain briefly, the idea of Graziano is that we have, on top of representation of first order representation of the apple, we can have a representation of the mental position of the attention towards the apple. So like a kind of second order representation. And so at that time, the team in Princeton of Graziano did a first deep learning implementation of attention schema with a perceptual task, where you had like a paddle, like a pong game, and you were physically moving your attention and removing noise where the attention was. So it's like kind of a first iteration of their idea of attention. What we tried to do in a similar sense was to test different hypotheses of relationship between awareness and attention, with attention schema being this last one. And so that's like the different implementation of that. And the difference is that we were interested in this early statement about how having to deal and predict other behavior could lead to improvement of your own cognitive ability. And so we show that indeed, like when you have this second order representation, it tends to help not only for cooperating with other agents, but also to solve your own task. So the second axis is temporal dynamics, and embodiment is kind of in both axes. And for here, like one motivation is that maybe dynamics is underrated in the way we represent things in machine learning. And this paper, I mean, now I think it's published actually by Ryota Kanai and colleagues, made a very nice point about the fact that meta-representation of a first-order representation is arbitrary, especially in like a multi-layer neural network. The boundary that you put between what counts as the first order and what counts as the second order is kind of where you put the index, but there is no categorical differences between those two things. And so you can have a functional difference with, like, for instance, in decision making, to have like representation of confidence and decision, like we heard early on. But what Ryota and colleagues propose is that you can also have a representation of the dynamics of the process that leads of the information processing. And so like that leads to a categorical difference of the information represented. And it's kind of aligned also with the growing literature of higher order statistics for neuroscience. And so there's like one of the 200 theories of consciousness that's compatible with that is the self-organized meta-representational account by Axel Cleermans. He's Belgium, so I took a Black and Mortimer style, where actually the global workspace is combined with this idea of having a first-order processing of information and a meta-representation of the flow of information at the first order. So we had like discussion with Axel, and it brought me back to the early days of neoconnectionism with the techniques that was initially used by J. Mike Leland nearby, which is the cascade mode. So like now people don't use that anymore because our GPUs are too fast. But at that time, computing a feed-forward pass was so expensive in compute that you have to do that one neuron at a time and then propagate the information. And so we voluntarily downgrade our model to have this flow of information at the first order network and have a second order network trying to capture these dynamics. And so we compare different architecture and show that not only like having a second order network help, but having the cascade on top have a kind of synergetic effect. So like to have a second order already functionally help, and we show that with the attention schema. But like this dynamical flow of information may be an interesting type of information to tap in. So recently we had also a review about like the intrinsic neural timescales of the brain. So like something that is a big debate right now is also like the substrate dependency of the functions that we're talking about. And well, the brain is a dynamical system with a lot of intrinsic dynamics and endogenous excitation. And in the case of social interaction, a lot of the work that we have been doing, typically with multi-brain recording and so on, show that those timescales scaffold the way we are interacting with other people. And so the last example I wanted to show you is, can we go back to pure dynamics and still have social interaction and social cognition? So we went back also to the good early days of NeuroAI with Breitenberg, which to me was like kind of the pioneer of NeuroAI in a sense, with his wonderful book on synthetic psychology. And instead of having these little robots of Breitenberg with neurons, we replace the neurons with oscillators, coupled, nonlinear coupled oscillators. And so that's a work with Axel Clearmans as well, and Nicolas Cook, who was a PhD visiting my lab. And so first we had like this little agent we call them Guidos, with 4 oscillators coupled between each other, 2 eyes and motors. And by varying the coupling between those oscillators and connecting the phase of the oscillator with the motors, we can have different behaviors. Like I don't know if you remember the spirograph things. So we spent tons of time looking at those little robots drawing patterns. And there is a sweet spot where actually if you train them properly, they go to the source of food. So here it's like a gradient of food, and even if it's a simple behavior, I mean, with just oscillator, it converts to the source of food. And there's like a sweet spot. Like if you have a low coupling, it gets like random. If it's too much high coupling, you have a kind of epileptic seizure in our little robots, and they don't do anything either. So once you have trained your robot to do a small gradient ascent, you can train them to make also decision making. So again, like there's no symbolic neurons here. It's just like dynamics system. And so like they can choose between 2 stimuli and which one has the most food. And ultimately, what we were interested in is to have like other agents and like having collective decisions. And so in that context, sometimes you have like successful consensus between the agents, and I think it's going to be a good echo to also the talk on hands later on. And sometimes you have failed consensus, and what we were interested in is how, because we are looking at synchronization between agent and brains, how those dynamics are characterized when they have successful consensus. And what we show is that actually the brain dynamics at the inter-agent level was higher in the successful consensus than the intra-brain synchronization. So there's like a boost in performance that is correlated with the alignment of the oscillatory activity between the agents. And so like there's that's the 3 parameters that we have, like internal coupling, coupling with the environment, and coupling with other agent. And there's like a kind of this valley where you have a sweet spot to reach consensus. And using not backprop, but just evolutionary algorithm, we can find those sweet spots to solve collective dynamics with those oscillatory agents. So as a conclusion, so I've tried to convince you that other agents are more than just part of the background of the environment. We are co-modeling the environment. And so finding other, folding other into this passive environment maybe lost something, and they carry also a form of latent model of the world as well as we do. And typically for caretaking, that can be a good things to study, because the infant kind of outsource part of the world model to the caretaker in a sense. And so relational world modeling means that those coupled latent dynamics can have potentially a mechanistic impact. So coordination is not just a computational primitive, it's a computational primitive, it's not just an afterthought that things are doing. So like in AI, often social cognition is treated as a task that you do once you have trained your model. Here it's kind of flipping the thing reverse and saying like actually it may be like a constitutive aspect of how intelligent behavior unfold in biology. And finally, it's the metacognition. The metacognition can be a bridge also from this internal world model and a social world model. So like representing our own processing facilitate agents that model others' agents. And theory of mind and metacognition might be actually the same capacity at the biological level, pointing either outward or versus inward. And so for the sake of this workshop, I found like 3 open questions. How to define an agent objective function when the world is modeling you as well. So like how to take into account this feedback loop of the environment on your own behavior. What does this relational aspect by you in power and performance compared to just a redescription of the world in terms of world modeling. And if social intelligence is that linked to coordination, what is alignment and how to foster it? So thank you very much for your attention. I did 20 minutes, so.
We have time for questions.
Yeah, Misha?
You said that socializing gives you evolutionary advantage, but there are still solitary animals like this.
Yeah, sure.
So because evolution is all about survival, so do you want to qualify them? Because
So like
they survived. Why do you say it's an advantage?
I mean, like in evolution, there is no like full right answer. But what we can see, for instance, in these social insects, there is like solitary bees and asocial bees that live in hives. Actually, I discovered also recently that shrimps, also there's a pistol shrimps that is a social shrimp. So there's like other form of social animals that do this kind of a social structure. And so evolution has discovered this kind of thing independently. And so like the cameral eye, it gives an advantage. I'm not saying that everybody needs to have eyes and everybody needs to be a social. And actually humans are less social than ants and bees because we are not like changing our own body given our task in the society. But definitely that's something that has been discovered multiple times in evolution, so it's warrants investigation in a sense.
Okay, thanks.
Yes?
For the agents, so they all train their own parameters, so to say, or there's one agent that train, or how do you?
For the Guidos, the little robots?
Yeah, the last result you showed.
So,
like how do they interact basically, and how does the training?
Yeah, so we do evolutionary algorithms, and usually you end up in this valley. In this triangle valley. If you have like more diversity in the agents, that leads to not necessarily worse performance. And actually, we have also work showing how diversity in the agents could help to make better decisions. I mean, that's also in the literature of social psychology. But if you have exactly the same model, the problem is that you're going to end up with the exact same trajectory. So it's kind of, yeah.
So you allow like individuality in your
Yeah.
groups, and then there's 2 agents or more.
No, we have like, here you have like all of them. So there are like 6 or 8.
Oh, I see. So does it depend on the size? Like how much, is there like an optimal group size?
That's a good question, actually. We don't look into that. Yeah, but we could definitely. I know in business school, actually, they're studying a lot that for brainstorming, and there's like a rough size of 7 people that is documented as an optimal size for a group discussion, for instance.
Yeah, breakout groups are too big.
Maybe. I like those are like a rule of thumb also, but yeah. But there's like also a very interesting work showing how also diversifying perspectives leads to better performance. So like there's this paper a science paper from 2010 by Bahadur Barami called Optimally Interacting Minds, where they show that actually by having a Gabor detection task, like classic vision science, doing that with another person and exchanging confidence of the visibility or not, allowed to be above the maximum performance of the 2 individuals separately. So there's a kind of a gestalt and collective intelligence. Yeah. Yes?
Just a comment. What you're doing is in the tradition of Varela and enacting.
Yeah.
It's really a generalization of the program that he had sort of started with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, unfortunately, like, yeah, he died very young, and this generative phenomenology was really like the direction he was planning to go. And I mean, I didn't dive too much into the neurophonology program, but related to what you explained for subjective experience, I mean, that's one of the key things. And in that sense, it's not trying to address the hard problem of consciousness, but more like diluting it, like and showing that. I mean, he was very inspired by Buddhism and Eastern philosophy, in the sense that this kind of non-reduction of co-constitution of two things, like in the drawing of Escher of the two ends drawing each other. Sometimes you can accept that as in Western philosophy, it's not like really like the kind of thing we like when there is like a circular causation, but like the project is to take as granted both subjective data and objective data, and not trying to reduce one to the other, and respect that those two data stand as a value. It has been highly criticized because of Wundt and introspectionism, but it's not the same thing as naive introspectionism as well. So it comes with like the idea of rigorous method to extract subjective experience. And that's like something also that in the last 10 years has been making a lot of progress. And now we are using, for instance, also LLMs typically to extract canonical topics, for instance, from verbatim of people describing their subjective experience. So like ultimately, like the idea is to map and have a bijection between the subjective space and the neural space, in a sense. Yes?
And robots, when performance goes up, it's for each robot on its own or for the whole?
No, collectively, yeah. It's a consensus performance there, yeah.
Okay, and then why is the movement negotiation going down when the performance goes up?
The performance at the end? The last curve, you mean?
Yeah. Is that meaningful?
The movement negotiation. Well, the thing is that you see on the panel J how if you're forcing too much coupling, at some point it's like a collective epilepsy in a sense. So they are like wandering in all directions, and it's a cacophony. So I guess like in that case, there's no even directions per se. Like they are like wandering around. So it's like in French we call like la sagesse des foules, but it's like the opposite. It's like the dumbness of crowds in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.